But still, we have a big transformational time underway in our country at the moment. And these usually happen when a president is faced with, when change is thrust on a president. That certainly begins a period that is transformational for a president, or sometimes we have presidents who actually embark on change themselves and try and bring the country along with them. Usually I think it happens in sequence. Usually some catastrophic or significant event changes the environment in which we're living and the way we think about issues. And then it's either up to that president to manage the change that's happened on his watch, or it's up to the next president to give shape to that. Think about some of the times since my grandfather, for instance, became president of the United States. That was a transformational time too. And while there was one president, Harry Truman, who was the immediate president after World War II, it was really the Eisenhower years, which were the years of revolution. You wouldn't know that actually by reading about those little sleepy days, you know, where I sat on the golf course the whole time and people are having little parties in poodle skirts and that type of thing. You know, Elvis Presley. No, actually they were revolutionary times. I'd like to say that the reason we can look back on it nostalgically and think of how peaceful it is simply that they were well-managed years. But the tectonic plate shifted for Eisenhower in 1953. It was very simple. Joseph Stalin died in March of that year, and in August, which was the big event, the Soviet Union broke America's monopoly on the hydrogen bomb. That changed everything. For the hydrogen bomb, which was 100 times more powerful than an atomic weapon that we used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this was an unthinkable weapon of awesome power. Bring with that delivery vehicles to actually deliver an atomic or a hydrogen bomb on the other side, and you had a formula for great potential danger. And so we could call maybe the transformational time of Eisenhower's period the time when there really was a revolution in military affairs. And then at the same time, of course, it was a period of great public and social change. Then, of course, we all remember, I think, well, the 1970s. We're hearing more about this because we had some of our current candidates reflecting back on Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. But the 1970s, I think, were marked by another tumultuous event, and that was the oil shocks of the early 70s. This brought a sense of impotence here in the United States, and we realized the full extent of what dependency on energy supplies abroad could really mean for this country. You may remember that Jimmy Carter took to wearing sweaters and turning out the lights at the White House. It was during that time that the Department of Energy was established, and I think on one of those chats that Jimmy Carter had with the rest of us, he talked about the oil shocks and the use of oil pricing as a weapon as the moral equivalent of war. We all noted later that the acronym was a little unsettling, meow, but nevertheless, it was a period of significant change. Since Carter did not win a second term, the challenge of managing a transformation of this type fell to Ronald Reagan, who really, in my book, transformed the way we think about wealth creation. In fact, this was the dawn of supply-side economics, trickle-down theory, and a new idea about who the job creators are and how that actually happens. The legacy of those ideas are still with us today, but indeed it was a period of revolution. Now, I'm not sure that you want to get me started on the United States' role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. I see no connection to speak of. That's for another lecture. In any case, though, we took this part of the world very seriously, as we should have, and actually engaged in a significant military buildup that began really significant government spending in that area. And so in the 1980s, then, we move into the big shift, the big geopolitical tectonic shift of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Without getting into the second lecture I promised you for another occasion, the United States actually supported the continuation of the Soviet Union, believe it or not. In 1991, we had an American president stand in Kiev and urge the Ukrainians to remain part of the Soviet Union. But in fact, the Soviet Union collapsed of its own weight through rigidity and an inhumane system that brought its tenuous hold on power to an end. In any case, this shift now was of substantial proportions. And the Clinton administration had the business of trying to manage what to do after the end of that period. We had many things that happened, but I think because we regarded ourselves as victorious at the end of the Cold War, parentheses, not to be mistaken with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a tendency actually not to rethink our strategic position, but just to double down and do more of the same. That's when NATO was expanded. We encircled Russia with our pipeline policy, and we took other measures that assumed that things were just more of the same, but we had now a new opportunity to bring our ideas to that part of the world. That, in fact, was true, but we did lose a strategic opportunity. And so the last big tectonic shift is the one we're living through right now. This, of course, started with 9/11, at least the most overt part of it. But in fact, many of the other elements of this particular shift started way before then. And of course, you know what I mean, the great financial crisis of 2008. And so that brings us to this period of, now what do we do? What do we do in an environment where we're being asked to think the unthinkable? Every day we're asked to think the unthinkable, as we were this summer when we actually debated who could have thunk that the United States of America would be debating whether or not we ought to make good on our obligations, our debt obligations to other countries. Pretty amazing. And then, of course, we had the downgrade of our credit, which has really made Americans ask themselves not only a set of questions they hadn't asked themselves before, but to really wonder about the underpinnings of this society as we go forward. And so it's with some amusement, having gone through a quick flip through the last 60 years, that we find that people sort of are talking like this upcoming election is sort of a normal election. Obama's being held to some kind of standard. Are you better off today than you were when he became president? Well, I think that we're missing the entire point here. We had those events in 2008 were a bipartisan crisis. The crisis began in a Republican administration that was part of a set of trends that were underway from well before that period. And now a Democratic president finds himself in a position to have to deal with this. In any case, all I can say, because I think we're going to have a fascinating election here, is that I don't actually think the difference is very stark. I think that both candidates are very much constrained by the institutional underpinnings of our country. That would be the idea that we would have a contest between, I think, what's the word they're using here now, the self-reliant versus the dependency issue is kind of irrelevant. It's hard to imagine that any big shift in those kinds of issues is going to take place. And yet we still have financial weakness that I'm sure worries all of you as we go forward. So let me just close by saying that my observation when the Soviet Union collapsed is that it brought underway a set of debates that took place in nearly every country but the United States of America. When the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, the Russian Federation was no longer part of the Soviet Union, nor were the newly independent states that had also been part of the Soviet Union. So they had to ask themselves, what kind of a country are we going to be? Now that we're not powerful anymore, now that our political system and our economies collapsed. And they sort of figured out the answer to that. They decided that they would be a European country. Eastern Europe had its huge debate. Well, we're not dependent on the Soviet bloc anymore. What kind of a country do we want to be? And Western Europe had that debate too. We're not dependent on the United States for our security anymore. What are we going to be if we're now independent from the framework that was very much a part of the Cold War. So the United States of America is the only country that hasn't had that debate yet, and we're having it now. And I can only say in closing that I think this is the healthiest thing that could happen to us. The problem is that it's happened 20 years later than it might otherwise have done. But we've got a very exciting time underway. We've got an enormous number of things to deal with, everything from financial stabilization to the wind down of two wars, to larger macro issues like climate change, which have in effect changed so much of our thinking. And so it's a real pleasure for me to be on the panel this evening and to be a part of this terrific event and to hear these great presentations that are yet to come. Thank you.